Have you ever wondered what happens in the seconds between life and death? Because I found out, in the most unexpected and terrifying way. While my body was surrounded by doctors, monitors beeping, voices racing, hands trembling, I was no longer there. Yes, technically I was still alive, but my soul, my consciousness, had already crossed the line. While they were saving me here, I was being judged somewhere else. You might think this is just another near-death experience story, but it's not. I didn't see tunnels of light. I didn't hear harps or see flowered fields. What I saw was judgment. It was truth. It was the weight of my soul laid bare. It all began with a strange feeling, like time had frozen. There was no pain, no sound, just the brutal awareness that something greater, invisible, and inescapable was watching me. I was out of my body, and what awaited me wasn't peace. It was confrontation. And you? Have you ever wondered if your life, every choice, every unspoken word, every moment of omission is being recorded? Because on the other side, nothing is lost. Everything is shown, uncut, no excuses. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm just going to tell you what I saw, what I felt, and what I still feel, even after coming back. If you've ever had a similar experience or know someone who's been through an NDE, share it in the comments. What do you believe exists on the other side? Do you believe there's judgment after death? I didn't until I was there. If stories like this speak to you, subscribe to this channel now, because what you're about to hear may change how you see life and what comes after it. Before everything happened, I was the kind of person who thought life was random, a chaotic sequence of chances and choices. None of them watched, none of them weighed. I never believed in a spiritual dimension. I never thought about what came after death because to me, death was the end, a blank page, darkness without memory, and even that didn't scare me. What scared me, in truth, was living with purpose. That meant accountability, that meant meaning, and meaning always leads to belief. And I didn't want to believe. I grew up around people who talked about God, who warned about the afterlife, who mentioned things like heaven and hell. I heard stories about souls leaving the body, about people seeing light, tunnels, figures of peace. But they were just stories to me, metaphors for people who couldn't let go. I used to smile politely when someone mentioned their spiritual journey, but deep down I judged them. I thought they were weak, afraid to face the finality of death. I used logic like a shield. Science was my comfort zone. If it couldn't be measured or proven, then it didn't exist. I thought that made me strong, independent. But now I see it was just fear in disguise, fear of facing something greater than myself. I wasn't a bad person, at least not in the way we usually define it. I didn't hurt people intentionally. I worked, paid my bills, laughed with friends, helped when it was convenient. But I lived only for myself. My choices were rooted in ego, in comfort, in avoiding discomfort. I ignored people in pain. I rejected moments where I could have been kind. I dismissed any inner voice that asked me to go deeper, to question. I drowned it in distraction, entertainment, work, noise. I surrounded myself with things that numbed the silence inside me, because I knew that silence was trying to say something I didn't want to hear. And as time passed, I built a version of myself that looked whole from the outside. I had achievements, plans, a future, but there was no soul in it, no connection. I didn't pray. I didn't meditate. I didn't reflect. I feared vulnerability. I feared being seen, not by people, but by something beyond people. A presence, a light, a truth. Even when I was alone, I felt watched, and I hated that feeling. So I buried it. I convinced myself it was just anxiety. Overthinking, old guilt from childhood beliefs. I had no space for spirit, no space for faith. I thought that made me free, but I wasn't free. I was floating, disconnected, hollow. My thoughts were loud, but meaningless. I felt like a shadow of something I didn't understand. Every once in a while I had dreams, strange ones, of falling, of being pulled into a place I couldn't describe. Not fire, not demons, just absence, coldness, like a void that knew my name. I would wake up shaking, sweating, but I never told anyone. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep. But a part of me knew those dreams were warnings, echoes, invitations to wake up, and I refused them all. I avoided funerals, I avoided hospitals, I avoided conversations about death, When people cried, I stayed quiet. I didn't know what to say. Not because I lacked empathy, but because deep down, I knew I had no answers. I couldn't offer comfort, because I had none inside me. I was terrified of loss, not because of the pain, but because loss raised questions I didn't want to face. Where do we go? What happens next? I didn't want to know. I thought ignorance would protect me, but ignorance is not protection. It is a wall, and that wall was about to collapse. I remember one night in particular. I was scrolling on my phone, and a video popped up. Someone talking about a near-death experience. They said they saw hell, that they were judged, that a voice asked them questions they couldn't answer. I rolled my eyes. I skipped it, but something lingered. A phrase they said kept playing in my mind. What if everything you ignored comes back to face you? That sentence followed me for days. I tried to forget it, but I couldn't, because deep down, I was starting to wonder if I had been wrong. I didn't tell anyone I was having doubts. I kept living my life, following routines, smiling when needed. But inside, something had cracked. A sense that the world wasn't as flat as I believed. That maybe consciousness wasn't tied to the brain. That maybe, just maybe, there was more. I didn't become religious. I didn't start praying, but I started to fear silence less. I started to listen, and in that listening, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years, a weight. Not heavy in a painful way, but heavy with meaning, like a quiet call, asking me to remember something I had forgotten long ago. Then came the day of the event. I was tired, more than usual. I brushed it off. Stress, I said, but it wasn't just stress. It was something deeper. My body knew, my soul knew, but I didn't. I kept moving, ignoring the signs, until everything stopped. The world faded. The noise disappeared. I felt a pull, a shift, like my entire being was being peeled away from everything I thought was real. And in that moment, there was no logic, no science, no theory, just awareness, raw, immediate, undeniable. And that's where it began. Not just the experience, but the truth, the unveiling. The moment when everything I believed was torn down in front of me. When I realized I wasn't the person I thought I was. That I had lived an entire life avoiding the very thing that would define me in the end. And I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide behind ideas or arguments, because none of that mattered there. What mattered was something else. Something I had spent years pretending didn't exist. Something that had waited for me, and now it had my full attention. It started with the beeping, the kind of sound that normally fades into the background like a machine humming in a hospital room, pulsing steadily. But this time, the beeping slowed, one tone longer than it should have been, then another, and suddenly, the rhythm wasn't there anymore. It was off. People moved quickly around me, their voices sharp but distant. I heard someone say my name, but it didn't feel like they were talking to me. It was as if the name belonged to a body they were trying to keep alive, but I was no longer in it. The air got thicker, everything blurred. The lights above me dimmed, not like someone turned them off, but like something inside my vision collapsed inward. I wanted to respond. I wanted to say I was still here, but my mouth wouldn't move. My hands wouldn't twitch. My body wasn't listening. And then came the cold. Not from the room or the bed or the IV. It was internal, like a wave that started deep in my chest and rolled out to every limb. A cold that didn't sting, but paralyzed. I was falling, but I wasn't moving. I was sinking, but nothing was pulling me down. My chest got tighter. My ears rang. The room stretched and folded in on itself, like the world was being peeled away from the edges. Everything stopped. There was no pain, no noise, just silence, and not the peaceful kind. This silence had weight. It wasn't emptiness. It was presence, heavy, watching, immense. I could feel something hovering beyond the veil of that silence. Not a figure, not a shape, but awareness. A massive, intelligent awareness. One that didn't need to speak to make itself known. It was like my entire existence was being observed from every direction at once. That's when I realized I was outside my body. I didn't see myself lying there. Not yet, but I felt the separation. My body had become irrelevant. I no longer needed breath, blood, muscles, or senses to exist. What remained was pure consciousness, raw perception, and that perception was expanding quickly, like my soul was no longer confined by bones or skin, but instead stretching outward, seeing, feeling, knowing. And then came the shift. It didn't feel like a tunnel or a corridor. It felt like being pulled through a thought, like something decided it was time, and I moved instantly. The hospital vanished. The machines, the people, the walls, gone. Not destroyed, just erased. What replaced them wasn't darkness in the usual sense. It was absence, a black so absolute it felt alive. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. I couldn't tell if I was moving or floating, but I was there, suspended in this nothingness. And I wasn't alone. Something was there with me. The pressure returned, not on my skin, but on my being. Like the very core of who I was under scrutiny. And it wasn't gentle. I felt layers of myself being pulled back. Memories, regrets, moments I had buried deep under years of denial and pride. They surfaced, not as images or flashes, but as full realities. I didn't just see my life, I relived it. Every lie I told, every time I looked away from someone in pain, every second I chose silence over compassion, every opportunity to love that I ignored. They came back not as stories, but as judgments. I wasn't alone, but nothing spoke. The judgment didn't come with a voice or a sentence. It was knowledge. I just knew. I knew I had failed. Not in the way we talk about failure here, but in the deeper way. I had failed my soul. I had been given time, choices, breath, and I used it all for myself. I felt the consequences, not as punishment, but as reality. In that place, consequences don't need explanation. They simply are. You feel them. You become them. The silence deepened. It started to hurt. Not physically, but spiritually. Like my very being was being peeled. I began to understand that everything I thought I had hidden was never hidden. Every moment of selfishness, every bitter thought, every unspoken resentment, every decision I justified with logic, they were there, alive, glowing, burning. I wasn't just remembering them, I was standing inside them. The pain was guilt, the kind that wraps around you and tightens. I couldn't move, I couldn't look away. My soul trembled. I tried to speak, but I had no mouth. I tried to run, but I had no legs. I was a consciousness drowning in its own truth. I wanted to scream, but the scream was inside, echoing without sound. It wasn't that I was being punished. It was that I was being revealed, and I had nothing to say in my defense. Then something changed. The blackness didn't disappear, but a pressure started building in front of me. A brightness that didn't shine, but vibrated. It didn't come from above or below. It was within the silence itself, like a presence had entered the space. But this presence didn't accuse, it didn't condemn, it simply knew. It knew me, and that knowing was more terrifying than any fire. I wasn't sure if this was the beginning of hell or the final chance before it. I wasn't sure if what I was experiencing was judgment or invitation, but I felt naked, exposed, seen in the most intimate and irreversible way. Everything I thought I was, every identity I had constructed, melted, and what remained wasn't strong or confident. It was a soul in crisis, a soul standing before its truth. I don't know how long I was there. There was no time, only awareness, endless, pressing, inescapable awareness. I began to feel smaller, not in size, but in significance. I was beginning to understand that I had never truly lived. I had existed. I had survived. I had constructed a life, but I had never awakened. I had never asked why I was here. I had never reached beyond myself, and now it might be too late. I wanted another chance, but I hadn't asked for one. I had never spoken a prayer, never looked up, never opened myself to anything greater. And now, in this place where souls were stripped bare and judgment wasn't a sentence but a mirror, I had nothing to offer. I had brought nothing with me, just my soul and its weight. And that weight was heavy, heavy with silence, heavy with darkness, heavy with every moment I wasted thinking death would be the end. But death was not the end, it was the door. Before you continue with this content that shows you what it's like to stand face to face with eternal judgment, you need to check out the ebook, Secrets of Life. This book reveals deep teachings from the scriptures, truths long forgotten by many. Lessons that will strengthen your faith, restore your spirit, and help you understand God's path even in your darkest moments. It's not just another book. It's a warning, a spiritual map for those who feel on the edge, between faith and emptiness, between the calling and the abyss. You don't have to wait for a life-altering wake-up call to open your eyes. After this video, click the link in the description and begin your spiritual turnaround today, because tomorrow might be too late. I didn't feel myself move. There was no sense of motion in the way we know it. One moment I was suspended in that heavy silence, and in the next I was simply somewhere else. But it wasn't a place, not in the physical sense. There were no walls, no floor, no visible dimension to speak of. Yet I was there. I existed, aware and utterly exposed, standing or maybe floating in something that wasn't space but held me nonetheless. What marked the change wasn't light or color. It was presence. A presence so absolute that it made everything else disappear. I could feel it watching me, not with eyes, but with knowing. A kind of knowing that went deeper than memory, deeper than thought. It was as if every part of me was being read simultaneously, not judged in anger, not analyzed with bias, just seen, completely and without distortion. The presence was vast. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It enveloped everything, and I was within its reach. I couldn't hide. Not even a fragment of me could escape its awareness. It was like standing in front of eternity and feeling it breathe through you. It knew me. Every secret, every moment I thought I had buried, every time I lied to protect myself, every time I looked away when someone needed help, every word I spoke in pride, every thought I had in silence. Nothing was left out. It didn't search for them. They came forward on their own, as if the truth could no longer bear to remain hidden. I began to feel my own life unfold before me, not like a movie. There were no clips or scenes. It was immersive. I was there, reliving, re-feeling, re-experiencing. Every interaction, every decision, every dismissal of conscience. It wasn't that I was remembering. It was that I was being. I became the other person in every encounter, not just myself. I felt what they felt. The pain I caused, the coldness I thought was subtle, the moments where I could have offered comfort but chose silence. I saw how my smallest actions echoed into others' lives, and I felt the weight of that ripple, the spiritual consequence of what I believed were small things. I tried to explain myself, not with words, because in that space, words were meaningless. I tried to justify, to resist, to tell the presence that I hadn't known better, that I was just surviving, just reacting to life like everyone else. But there was no room for deception. The truth didn't argue. It simply was. And in that wasness, I saw the gap between who I had been and who I was meant to be. The distance between my potential and my choices. It wasn't punishment, it was revelation. But revelation without preparation is agony. It tears through illusion, and illusion was all I had left. There were no flames, no screams, just reality. More real than anything I had ever experienced on earth, and that reality was piercing. I didn't hear a voice, but I felt a question rise in the air around me. Not spoken, but understood. What did you do with the life you were given? The moment that question settled into my awareness, everything else dimmed. The presence didn't accuse, it simply held the truth, and the truth was enough. The more I stood, or floated, or existed in that realm of spiritual exposure, the more I realized how disconnected I had been. I saw myself through different eyes, not the eyes of ego or fear, but the eyes of eternity. And what I saw broke me. I wasn't a monster. I hadn't killed. I hadn't stolen. But I had lived small. I had avoided love when it demanded effort. I had chosen safety over purpose. I had dismissed the divine when it whispered in my loneliness. I had been given a soul, and I had buried it beneath ambition, pride, and fear of vulnerability. In that place, nothing external mattered. Not money, not image, not success. Only what had been done with the moments that were meant for connection. How had I treated the sacred that exists in every human interaction? How often had I been present, truly present with another soul? How often had I ignored the subtle call to act, to speak, to lift? The silence around me now was no longer just absence. It was reflection. It gave space for everything I had never dared to confront. I felt myself trembling. though I had no body. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the very structure of my being was shaking under the weight of what I now knew. And still, the presence didn't move. It just was. It didn't come closer. It didn't retreat. It didn't console or chastise. But its stillness demanded my honesty. Not to it, but to myself. There was no hiding anymore. I began to notice other things. Energies, maybe. Forms. I don't have the words for them. They were like shadows of choices, the ghosts of paths I didn't take, possibilities I rejected out of fear, relationships I could have healed, people I could have forgiven, and with them came emotions, waves of regret, sorrow, longing, not because I was being punished, but because I could finally see clearly, and in that clarity, I understood what I had missed. There was something deeply sacred about that moment, even in its pain. I wasn't just being shown what I had done. I was being invited to see what I was, the essence of who I had become after every decision, every turning away from truth, every time I silenced the voice that called me to live with more light. That voice had never stopped. Even when I ignored it, it was there. And now, standing in this place where nothing could be hidden, I felt its echo. The presence seemed to pulse, not in movement, but in intensity, as if my awareness was being drawn deeper into its center. And within that center there was more, a level of perception that reached beyond morality, beyond behavior. It was about intention, the heart behind the action, the whisper behind the word, the soul behind the smile. I could see how often I had smiled without sincerity, helped while expecting reward, loved conditionally. Even my good deeds were placed under light, and I could see where ego had crept in. It was humbling, devastating, necessary, and yet, in the depth of that spiritual nakedness, I felt something else. Not comfort, not escape, but opportunity, as if the presence, in all its silence and stillness, was waiting, not for perfection, but for recognition. For me to see myself as I truly was. For me to admit that I had spent an entire life pretending I wasn't being watched, pretending that my soul belonged only to me, pretending that the choices I made in secret would never be spoken again. They were all being spoken now, without sound, in the language of the eternal, and I could no longer deny them. It began slowly, not as a flash or sudden vision, but as an unveiling. The space around me, the presence that watched, the silence that pressed in from all sides, began to pulse with something deeper. I could feel it like a heartbeat, though it wasn't physical. Each pulse pulled something out of me, a memory, a moment, a truth. They emerged not in sequence, but in weight, the heaviest. Things came first, the ones I had buried the deepest, the ones I had hoped would never surface. But here, nothing stayed hidden, nothing could. The first thing I saw, no, felt, was a lie I told when I was young. A simple thing, harmless I thought, but now I was inside it. I saw the face of the person I lied to. I felt their confusion, their hurt, and I couldn't look away. I felt both sides. My indifference at the time, their trust breaking. It echoed between us, and I stood in that echo, trembling. Before I could process it, another memory pulled me in. A moment when someone asked for help. I was busy. I brushed them off, told myself it wasn't my problem. Now I stood inside their pain. I saw how they had looked back after I turned away, how they had waited, hoping I'd return. I never did, and so it continued, one after another. Some memories I hadn't thought about in years, others I thought I had forgotten completely. They came with no mercy, but not with malice either. They came because they were true, and this place, wherever I was, could not exist in the presence of anything false. Every cruel word I had spoken, every judgment I had made behind someone's back, every moment I had chosen silence over kindness, they were all alive here, living, breathing, shaping the soul I now stood inside. There was no courtroom, no jury, no accuser, but I felt judged, not by anyone else, but by the truth itself. The presence around me did not speak, but it radiated clarity. Couldn't lie to myself here. I couldn't make excuses. Every justification I had used on earth dissolved like smoke. They had no power here. I wanted to scream, not in anger, in sorrow. I wanted to beg for a chance to undo it all, but this wasn't the time for begging. It was the time for seeing, fully, finally. I began to cry. I don't know if tears are possible without a body, but I wept in a way I never had before. I wept not because I was afraid, but because I understood. I saw the real damage. I saw how I had hardened my heart to others, how I had chosen my own comfort again and again, how I had laughed off pain that wasn't mine. I saw the emptiness of my pride, the emptiness of my achievements when disconnected from compassion. I saw how I had failed love, not romantic love, the bigger kind, the eternal kind, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything. Time didn't exist, but the judgment did not end quickly. It was slow, relentless, gentle and crushing at the same time. Some memories came with a whisper. Others hit like waves. There was one moment I'll never forget. A stranger had asked me for directions. I was in a rush. I answered coldly, irritated, dismissive. That was years ago. Yet here, in this place, I saw the aftermath. I saw how that moment had followed them, how they felt small, insignificant, how my tone had added weight to a day already heavy with pain. I thought I was just being efficient. Now I saw the wound I had left, and there were many like it. Every missed opportunity to lift someone, every harsh judgment I had thrown at others in my mind. They weren't gone. They were part of me, and now they stood around me like shadows, not to accuse but to be seen, and I saw them all. The presence didn't turn away. It didn't withdraw. It stayed, constant, silent, watching, holding space for the truth to rise. Its stillness was both terrifying and holy. I felt like I was being unraveled, my soul stripped down to its rawest form. I had never known vulnerability like this. Nothing was hidden, and yet I was not destroyed. I was still here, still conscious, still aware. That awareness hurt, but it was also sacred. It was the first real awareness I had ever known. As more memories unfolded, I began to see patterns. I saw how fear had ruled me, how so many of my decisions were shaped not by love, but by avoidance. I avoided confrontation. I avoided discomfort. I avoided depth. I kept relationships surface level. I protected myself at all costs, even when it meant letting others drown. I had built walls and called them wisdom. I had walked away from people and called it strength. But now, stripped of ego, stripped of my narratives, I saw the truth. It wasn't strength. It was fear, and fear had cost me everything that mattered. The presence never flinched. It remained unmoved, like a mirror that could not be cracked. And I, the reflection, was forced to see myself, not as others saw me, not even as I saw me, but as I truly was. My intentions, my motivations, my avoidance, my refusal to grow, my clinging to comfort when I had been called to something higher. It was all here, surrounding me, within me. There was no running, no hiding, just being, just facing. And still, more memories came. Acts of kindness I had forgotten, moments of genuine compassion. They were here too, smaller, but glowing. They brought warmth, brief, gentle. But even those moments were surrounded by questions. Why hadn't I lived like that more often? Why had I rationed my love? Why had I made generosity conditional? I had glimpses of who I could have been, and those glimpses cut deeper than any condemnation. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like an eternity. Maybe it was, or maybe it was just the fullness of awareness. But when the memories slowed, when the waves of revelation paused, I wasn't the same. Something in me had been broken open, something raw, something true, but it wasn't over. I knew that. I could feel the next layer coming, deeper still, more truth, more exposure, and I wasn't ready, but I had no choice. Just when I thought I had reached the limit of what my soul could bear, something changed in the atmosphere around me. The heaviness of judgment, the suffocating stillness of self-confrontation, gave way to a shift so subtle yet so profound that it left my being in total silence. It began as a warmth, not from the outside, but as if the very core of my existence was being gently stirred. There was no movement, no sound, but I felt it approaching, not with footsteps, not with noise, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that belongs only to eternity. Then, without warning, light appeared. It wasn't blinding. It wasn't overwhelming. It didn't flood the darkness with force or violence. It arrived like a truth that had always been there, waiting. A light that did not need to declare itself. It simply was. It didn't come to erase the shadows. It came to reveal what had always been hidden within them. And I stood there, or floated there, suspended in that weightless void as the light expanded, not outward, but inward, into me. And it hurt, but not in the way pain hurts the body. It hurt in the way truth hurts the soul. It was not accusation, it was revelation. And that revelation was unbearable. Everything I had just seen, every act, every failure, every betrayal of love, came rushing back. But now they weren't only mine, the light held them too. And in the brilliance of that presence, they could no longer hide. I felt the searing exposure of all I had done, and all I had failed to become. This light did not condemn. It didn't need to. Its very nature was so pure, so complete, so full of everything I had ignored and avoided, that standing near it made the impurity of my own soul burn. The light was aware, alive, conscious beyond anything I had ever known, and it was looking at me, not with eyes, with being. It wasn't observing me as a stranger. It was seeing me as one who had always been known, and that was what undid me. I wasn't just being watched. I was being remembered, as if this presence had never forgotten who I truly was, even when I had. And then, within the unbearable clarity of that gaze, I understood. He knew everything, every secret, every shadow, every regret, every thought I had buried so deeply I didn't even recognize it anymore. He knew every moment I had doubted, every time I had cursed the silence, every time I had denied his presence in my life. He knew the moments I claimed not to care, the days I mocked faith, the nights I sat in the dark and chose bitterness over belief. He knew it all, and still, he looked at me with compassion. That one realization shattered me more than all the judgment that had come before it, because it was pure, unprovoked, unjustified by anything I had done. I didn't deserve it. I hadn't earned it. And yet, there it was, undeniable, unwavering, the kind of compassion that sees you completely and chooses not to turn away, the kind that stands in your filth and doesn't flinch, the kind that breaks you not by force, but by grace. In that gaze, I felt known in a way I never had before, not known for what I had achieved, not known for what others thought of me, not even known in the way a close friend or family member might know me. This was deeper. It reached into the blueprint of who I was meant to be. It saw not just my choices, but my design. It saw the echoes of the person I was created to become, and the grief of how far I had strayed from that path. And still, he didn't look away. The light pressed deeper into me, not to harm, but to heal. But healing, real healing, is never comfortable. It unearths what we've buried. It dismantles what we've protected. It burns what is not aligned with love. And I was full of things that needed burning. Pride, fear, self-deception, anger. All of it rose to the surface in the presence of that divine gaze. I felt exposed in ways that made my soul tremble. I had nowhere to hide. And strangely, for the first time, I didn't want to hide. Because even in the unbearable truth of who I had become, I sensed an invitation, a call, a possibility that even this soul, my soul, could be redeemed. And then the silence returned, not empty, sacred, holy, the kind of silence that speaks more than words ever could. In that silence, I felt him speak, not with sound, with being. And though there were no words, I knew what he was saying. I knew because it was written in the fabric of everything I had, just experienced. It was written in the light itself. I felt the questions rise, not spoken, but understood. Do you see? Do you understand? Do you remember who you are? It wasn't anger. It wasn't wrath. It was longing. And that longing came not from weakness, but from an unfathomable depth of love. Love that burns but does not destroy. Love that wounds so it can heal. Love that waits even when it has been forgotten. I couldn't speak. Not because I wasn't allowed, because I had no words left. No defenses, no arguments, only awe and sorrow, and something that felt like the beginning of surrender. I had always imagined judgment as a courtroom, a verdict, a gavel slamming down. But this was something else. This was a meeting. A reckoning, yes, but one woven with mercy. A justice so pure that it contained compassion. A light so honest it could only come from love. I didn't deserve it, but it was there. He knew everything. And still, he looked at me with compassion. I don't know when. It started, the sound. It was distant at first, like echoes rising through thick water. Then came the sensation. Not pain exactly, but pressure. Then weight. A heaviness that didn't belong to the soul. A pull that felt unnatural after the weightlessness I had known. My awareness shifted. Slowly, reluctantly. The light, the presence began to dim. Not because it left, but because I was being pulled from it. Something else was calling me back. Something urgent, noisy, cold. I heard voices, not the silent voice of truth that had just looked into me, but human voices. Shouting, commanding, panicked. I couldn't make out the words, only the desperation in them. Then came the beeping, a rapid stutter of sound that broke through the sacred stillness I had just left behind. Machines, life support, alarms. My body was somewhere in that chaos, and it was calling me home. I didn't want to go. My soul still trembled from the gaze of eternity. My being was still wrapped in the echo of compassion that had no reason to look at me with mercy. But the pull grew stronger. My awareness began to narrow. The vastness of spiritual perception collapsed inward. I felt it like a reverse birth, a compression, a falling. My soul contracting, squeezing through something invisible. Then the pain came, sharp, real, blinding in its familiarity. My chest burned, every breath like fire. I felt the jolt before I knew what it was. Electricity. They had shocked me. I was back inside flesh. I could feel limbs. Again, but they didn't feel like mine. I was crammed inside something too small, too noisy, too broken. My skin itched with the memory of what I had just left. I wanted to cry out, but the air wouldn't come fast enough. My lungs screamed for oxygen. I choked, I coughed, I gasped, but I was back, and nothing was the same. The room was a blur of movement. People hovered above me, voices overlapping. I heard my name, but it didn't feel like mine. That name belonged to the person I had been before. A person who didn't know light could expose without destroying. A person who had lived half asleep, half aware. A person who believed death was the end. That person had died, and someone else had returned. The physical pain didn't compare to the spiritual weight I still carried. My soul hadn't caught up. It still lingered in the echo of judgment, in the memory of divine compassion. My body trembled not from shock, but from grief. Grief for who I had been. Grief for what I had seen. Grief for a world that would never understand what had just happened to me. I looked into the faces around me, searching for something familiar, but all I saw were people unaware of what lay just beyond the veil. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to scream that everything matters, that every moment is recorded, that love is the only currency that crosses into eternity. But no words came. My mouth was dry. My mind was spinning. My chest still ached with every breath. And yet, behind all of that, behind the tears that welled in my eyes and the noise that filled the room, I still saw him. Not in form, not in vision, but in memory. The kind of memory that burns brighter than anything this world has to offer. He knew everything. And still, he looked at me with compassion. That look was etched into me, branded into the fabric of my soul. It clung to every cell. It whispered beneath every heartbeat. As the machine stabilized, as the room calmed, I lay still, replaying everything. Not just what I had seen, but what I had become in his presence. I had been known, and now I was here, again, in a world that moves too fast to notice the sacred. In a body that aches to return to that place of eternal stillness and unfiltered truth. Time passed. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. I wasn't sure. I was conscious, but not fully here. I heard doctors say things, numbers, conditions. I was stable, but I wasn't okay. Not inside. Inside, I was still unraveling, still shattered from the gaze that had seen me completely and loved me anyway. The body recovered faster than the soul. My eyes blinked. My heart pumped, but my spirit was still stuck in the space between. I wanted to hold on to that presence, that light, but it faded slowly, like the last note of a song you never wanted to end. I tried to recall his face, but there had been none, only being. I tried to remember his voice, but there had been no words, only knowing. What I remembered most was the feeling, the weight of truth, the warmth of compassion, the mirror that showed everything without judgment, yet demanded transformation. People spoke to me, nurses, family, friends. I nodded, I listened, but I was far away. I couldn't explain. How do you explain that your soul has been weighed in a place where time doesn't exist? How do you explain that you met something divine and it didn't condemn you? It revealed you. I began to cry again, quietly, not from pain, not from fear, but from the ache of returning, the ache of knowing, the ache of remembering that I had stood in the presence of eternal love and now was back in a world of noise and forgetting. I wept because I knew what I had to do, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to do it. I wept because the veil had closed again, and all I had left was memory. But in that memory, I clung to the one truth that would not leave me. He knew everything. And still, he looked at me with compassion. The days that followed felt like walking between two worlds. I was here, but not fully. I spoke, but part of me remained silent. I moved through routines, but my soul was still staring into eternity. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. People smiled at me with relief, grateful I had survived. But they didn't understand that the person who had survived was not the one who had entered that hospital room. That version of me was gone. What returned was a soul stripped down to its most honest state, branded by truth, haunted by mercy. I couldn't go back to who I had been. I didn't want to. Something inside me had changed permanently. The way I saw others, the way I spoke, the way I listened. I could no longer ignore people. I saw their pain differently. I noticed the heaviness in their eyes, the quiet battles in their hearts. I recognized what I had ignored before, because now I knew. I knew how every act, every word, every thought carried weight. I knew what it meant to be truly seen, and I couldn't unknow it. Forgiveness became urgent, not just asking for it, but giving it. There were people I had hurt with silence, people I had walked away from, people I had judged unfairly. Their faces came to me in the quiet moments, and I couldn't push them away. I reached out. I apologized. Some accepted, others didn't. But I knew I had to try. Not because I feared judgment, but because I had felt compassion from the very source of truth. And now, I had to reflect it. There was one conversation I had avoided for years. A family member I had pushed away over an old argument that now seemed so small, so absurd. I called. I spoke through tears. I said everything I should have said a long time ago. And when they forgave me, it felt like another piece of my soul came back into place. Like part of me had been scattered in the past. And now, with every act of reconciliation, I was gathering myself again. I started praying, not with perfect words, not even with structure, just honesty. I spoke to the presence that had looked at me in silence. I spoke from my rawest place. Sometimes I just sat there, quiet, letting the memory of that gaze fill the room. I didn't know if I was doing it right, but I knew I had to stay connected to what I had felt. I had touched eternity, and I never wanted to lose that connection. Faith became a lifeline, not religion, not ritual. Faith, the certainty that I had been seen and spared for a reason, that my life, even in its brokenness, had meaning, that I had been returned, not just to survive, but to serve. That there was something I was meant to do, someone I was meant to become. I didn't have a detailed plan. I just knew I had to live differently. I had to live with intention, with compassion, with awareness. I started sharing my story, quietly at first, with close friends, with people who were struggling. I didn't want to sound dramatic. I didn't want to scare anyone. But something in me knew that someone needed to hear it, that someone out there was just like I had been, lost, numb, convinced that death was the end and life was only about getting by. And maybe, just maybe, my story could be the crack in the wall they had built around their own soul. One night, I sat down and wrote everything, every detail, every feeling, not to make sense of it, but to honor it, to remember. to never forget. And in writing it, I felt like I was carving a message into stone, not for the world, but for the future version of myself, the one that might forget again, the one that might get distracted, because I knew life would pull at me, the noise, the routine, the responsibilities. But I also knew I had seen something no noise could silence, no routine could erase. I began volunteering, not out of obligation, out of overflow. I needed to give. I needed to look into the eyes of someone in pain and say, I see you, not with pity, but with recognition, because I had been there, not just in suffering, but in distance, in disconnection. And now that I had come back from the edge, I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't keep the mercy I had received to myself. There were nights I still woke up crying, not from fear, from longing for that presence, longing for that light, longing for the gaze that held every part of me and still chose compassion. And when the longing became too heavy, I would sit in the dark, breathe deeply, and remember. I would remember that I had been seen, and because of that I could see others. I could love better. I could live braver. Today, when I speak, it's with purpose. When I listen, it's with presence. When I forgive, it's with sincerity. I still fail. I still forget. But I come back faster. I return to that gaze in my mind, and it pulls me back to truth. I'm not here to scare anyone. I'm not here to argue theology or prove anything. I'm here because someone needs to hear this before it's too late. Someone who thinks they're too far gone. Someone who's numb. Someone who's buried their soul under layers of distraction and denial. I was that person, and I was given a second chance. I don't know why I was sent back, but I know this. What you do here matters. How you love matters. Who you choose to be in the quiet moments when no one is watching. That's what echoes in eternity. And eternity is not far away. It's closer than you think. There are moments in life that define you, not because of what happens to you, but because of what they awaken inside you. This was one of those moments. I don't tell this story for attention. I don't share it for curiosity or spectacle. I share it because something sacred was entrusted to me. An experience that tore away every mask I had worn. An experience that shattered my ego, exposed my soul, and whispered a truth that still echoes in everything I do. I saw my life without filters, without excuses. I saw it through the eyes of eternity. And what I saw was not enough. Not because I wasn't successful, or kind, or hardworking, but because I had lived asleep. I had moved through years, numbed by routine, buried under distractions, convinced that life was about survival. I had silenced the voice that called me to something more, something eternal. When I stood in that space beyond life, when the divine presence looked at me and showed me everything I had become, I felt something deeper than punishment. I felt truth, and the truth didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It simply was. And in that wasness, I saw it all. The pride, the selfishness, the fear, the masks I wore to appear strong, the roles I played to avoid being vulnerable. I saw how I had lived trying to control everything, my image, my safety, my story, when what I needed was surrender. I had always imagined hell as fire, but it wasn't. Not for me. Hell was seeing my life without masks. Hell was the full awareness of what I could have been and chose not to be. Hell was standing before pure love and realizing I had spent my life turning away from it. There was no screaming, no flames, just clarity. And it burned deeper than anything physical ever could. And now I'm here, still breathing, still waking up in this world, surrounded by people who don't know how thin the veil is, how close eternity actually is. We think we have time. We think we'll figure it out later. But what if later never comes? What if this moment, this story, is your moment? What if you're hearing this because something in your soul has been trying to wake up? What if this isn't just a story, but a warning, a sacred interruption, a reminder that your life matters beyond what you can see? Because it does. Every thought, every action, every choice, it all matters. And when this life ends, and it will end, you won't carry your status, your wealth, your fears, or your titles. You'll carry your soul and everything it became. So if you've made it this far with me, maybe this wasn't just about me. Maybe this story was a message for you too. A divine echo, a crack in the illusion, an invitation to stop running from yourself, to stop hiding behind comfort, to stop assuming there will always be more time, because one day there won't be, and on that day, everything will be seen. And I pray that when that day comes, you won't meet truth as a stranger,